In this video, you will see interesting pawn endgames, such as pawn races, shouldering technique, Zwang, and so on. This video has the timestamps below, so if you would like to move on to another chapter, if you have seen this position, feel free to browse around. So, let's talk about the pawn races. In these positions, of course, you should try your best to promote to the queen as soon as possible, and black tries to do the same. These are the situations when none of the kings can actually stop the pawn. Black can't stop the b-pawn, and white cannot stop the h-pawn because enemy's king is preventing. So you try to go for the queen as soon as possible, and whenever you get the final position, you should not just say that it will be a draw because both of the sides managed to promote the queen simultaneously. You should always look for some checks or tricks at the end of the variation if it is your move. In this case, white can play queen g8 check, forces black's king to get along the h-file, and white wins the queen and the game as well. This is an amazing example of the active king. White's latest move, rook c1, offers the rook straight. Black can't move the rook away because of rook c7, and white will be grabbing all the pawns on the queen side, so black accepts this bluff and goes for king f6. The reason why this position is worse for white and objectively lost because of the h2 pawn's weakness. White can't do anything else, there are no breakthroughs, and black is trying to grab this weak pawn on h2. White's king goes to the defense, and after a couple of moves we see that our king is considerably more active compared to its counterpart on g1, and the next thing what you have to do is just to activate all of your pawns as well. Black starts with e5, king h1, king g1 are sort of like the only options what white has got right now, and b5. This move is typically extremely technical, tries to fix the pawns on the queen side, so there's no a4 or b5 ideas right there. And after pushing all the pawns forward, what black wants to do is just bring the king somehow towards the center or on the queen side. It's impossible because white's pawns are standing on the way, so after some trades right now, black goes with h4 with the idea of h3 of g3, and if the pawns get traded, black's king can easily capture the e4 pawn. This is exactly what happens, and at the end white simply resigns. It's just impossible to stop king f4 followed by king e4 threats. Actually, this is one of my favorite topics called Zwang. It's a German word, and if we will explain it, it's the situation where you don't want to be your move. So in the current situation, we see that both of the kings are trying to grab enemy's pawn and simultaneously protecting their own. If it will be white to move, white is forced to move the king away from f5. It can be on g5, g4, anywhere else, and black simply grabs the pawn on e4. Next move will be d4 or d3 with the king and pushing the pawn. It will be easily winning for black. But what happens if it's black to move? It's the same scenario. The king has to move from d4 square because it's forced, and whenever the king gets there, white grabs the pawn on e5 and the game will be winning. So right now, none of the side wants it to be their move. So if you play as black, you want it to be white's move, and if you play as white, you want it to be black's move. So sometimes having an extra move is not really good in the endgames. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to click like and subscribe the channel. Whenever we reach 10,000 subscribers, there will be a free giveaway, free video courses from my website. Let's talk about the shouldering technique. In this position, black obviously wants to grab the pawn on h2 as soon as possible, and white has exactly the same intention connected to the h3 pawn. If black continues with a logical move such as king d2, if you see in this race, white clearly is going to lose because black is on time to put the king on g2, take the h2 pawn, and even though it's an extra h pawn, because white's king is not stopping in front of it, black can easily promote it to the queen and win the game. Well, if we go back a little bit, we understand that it's just simple. Black might just win the game after grabbing the pawn. But it's not as easy as it looks like. When white understands that it's impossible to protect the h2 pawn, it is essential to understand that whenever black's king gets to the h2 pawn, if white's king will be on f2 or f1, actually it will be a drawn endgame. For instance, after king d2, king f6, when this king gets to the g2 square, white's plan is to get to f2 square as soon as possible. And after king e3, king h2, king f2, this is already drawn because black can't move the king away from the h-file in case of king h1, king f1. We can move the kings back and forth all day long, white doesn't mind, and in case of h2, it will end up with a stalemate. So what white wants to do in the starting position is to bring the king towards the f2 square. It is impossible to go for it directly because whenever the kings get to these squares, you can't just go to f3 square because black's king is standing there. But actually this position is not a draw, even though it looks like if black just grabs the pawn, white is on time to get to f2. It is important to capture the pawn properly. So right now, if you go directly, you need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves. And if you try to go from this direction, 1, 2, 3, 4, you also need 5 moves to grab the h2 pawn. But it is very important to go for this direction, because when you go king d3, if white tries to do the same plan, king f6, there is king e4. So white can't put the king on e5, therefore the king cannot end up on the f2 square, which automatically means that white loses another tempo and the game respectively. If king e6, there is king f3, and because of this one extra tempo, white is not on time to get on f2, there is king g1, h2, h1 comes next. So you can use sometimes the shouldering technique, and sometimes the best way is not the most direct to capture the pawn. Maybe, meanwhile, you want to prevent your enemy's king to get to some central squares. Breakthrough. When you're in big trouble and you understand that your king is significantly weaker compared to its counterpart, it's easy to understand that black is just definitely on time to grab all the pawns and we can't do much. So at that time, you need to try desperately to create a passed pawn as soon as possible. And if you have 3 pawns versus 3 pawns, it's common that you can make a breakthrough. It is essential to start with g6 immediately. If you try with the move such as f6 and the pawns are just getting traded, black's king can easily grab this pawn, then another one on h5, and black wins the game on spot. Therefore, here you have to start with g6. The time is ticking, and if you try to make regular moves, black's king is grabbing all the pawns. So we need to start with g6. What happens next? Obviously, the threat is to capture any of the pawns on f7 or h7. Black will not allow that. So if h6 or f6, it will be easy victory for white. It is important to grab the pawn. If the pawn takes from the f file, now we are not planning to grab all the pawns here and go for the exchanges, allow black's king to grab the pawn, and actually it will be a drawn at the end, but still. So after f takes g6, the best move what white can do is to go with h6. Now we attack the pawn on g7, g takes f5 will lead to h takes g7 with a victory for white, and if this pawn trade will be happening, now it's impossible to stop the f pawn. Pawns cannot do that, and enemy's king is way far away. So after f takes g6, it's already lost after h6. If black tries to do h takes g6, there will be f6 with exactly the same plan. So if pawn takes, you go h6, h8, and after that, it's easy to say that white wins the game. Outside passed pawn. White has equal balance, and it's not like we have an extra pawn, but you see that we have 2 pawns on the king side versus 3, and there is 1 pawn standing alone. Typically, if you try to activate the king and go to king e3, for instance, king d4, king d6, we already know that the a extra pawn cannot get promoted if enemy's king will be stopping it, which will be the case right now. But the difference right now is that you can actually distract the enemy's king while it tries to grab this passed pawn, and it definitely requires enemy's king attention, obviously, otherwise you just promote to the queen easily. And whenever the king gets there, that's why it's important to have an outside passed pawn, that you will have enough time to just sneak in your enemy's camp and grab all the pawns on another flank. So after activating the king, we go with a4, trying to distract the king. And after this happens, we go with king e5. We are not trying to hold on to this pawn because it will not lead us to anywhere because extra a pawn can't win the game. But now, because black's king is forced to stay around, if the king stays on c6, we'll go a6, a7. In any case, we'll force black's king to grab the pawn. We can just get closer to enemy's camp and grab all the pawns. Look at the moves though. g5. If black just tries to play random moves like trying to activate the king, by big margin, white can just go here, push the h-pawn, or even take the f5 pawn, and it will be easily winning. So here you have to be cautious, because if your opponent's pawns will start running like that, and if you will be busy grabbing all the pawns, for instance, in this case, if you'll take the h6 pawn, unfortunately, white loses the game after g4, because black can create a passed pawn on its own after playing king g5, f3, so do not play these positions automatically, because now black wins the game. So try to pay attention that these pawns will be well stopped and there will not be any passed pawn creation. So you go with h3, preventing g4. There's no h5 because this will be captured. f3 is also under control, as well as g4 square. So after h3, king b4, you take this pawn, grabbing the g5 as well, king f4, and obviously white wins the game. Protected passed pawns. This is really good asset to win the game. As you can see, white has connected pawns, and typically these cannot be captured by enemy's king that easily. So right now, all you have to do is just to grab the pawn on h7, and there is not a single thing what white can do about it. You start with king g4 with the intention of getting to h5, h6 and taking the pawn. And if you'll take the pawn and bring the king all the way down there to help your pawns, of course with 2 extra pawns it will be easily winning. After king g4, black cannot just stand around and let you capture the pawn and win the game. So they want to go for king a3, trying to get to the weakest pawn. b3 cannot be captured because another pawn protects it. But after you play king h5, that's the main beauty of having a protected passers, that your enemy's king cannot grab the pawn, because you just start pushing forward, and because black just wasted enough time to take the pawn, they're already outside of horizon, so you can promote the pawn to the queen first. And if black just stands around with the king c5 or whatever, something similar, you'll be very happy to go for king h5, h6, h7, just capture the pawn and claim the victory. Now I want to talk about one of the rarest motive in the endgames, the stalemate in the pawn endings. As you can see, enemy's king is extremely active, and if you try to grab the pawn or do anything like that, we have to go for king g4. Black is on time to take our f5 pawn, and there is not a single thing we can do about that. If you try to grab the h7 pawn, there will be already king g4 happening. f5, f4, this pawn is also gone, and black will win the game. It is essential to know that after you take on h7, that black can play f5 because of king g6, supporting h5 and at the same time attacking the pawn. This will lead to a draw, but here black can play king h5, not allow you to bring the king there, nor push the pawn, and this pawn goes down to f1 and wins the game. So right here we have extremely inactive king, but guess what? White actually has a hope to save this game. It's important to start with king g4. Well, you might be surprised what happens next, because black can easily go for king e5 or maybe even king e4 and attack the king. But that's the main beauty. Right now, white goes with g6, and we attack the pawn on h7. If black takes it, white has enough time to grab it, and because we can create a passed pawn, it's time for black to push f5 as soon as possible, and whenever we see this race, it becomes obvious that white is exactly on time to promote to the queen, and it leads to an equal position. So after g6, black has to play h6. And if you move the king away, there will be king f5 coming, and it looks like white is lost. But we have an amazing move such as king h5, and now black cannot take the pawn, because there will be a stalemate. Otherwise, white goes back and forth, king g4, king h5, as long as they can do that, and black cannot win the game. Let's move on to queen versus pawn endgames. When you have an extra queen versus pawn, it depends where your enemy's pawn is standing. Sometimes you can win the game, sometimes not. You see your enemy's king is standing on the second rank and is just only one move away from promotion. You have to be very cautious. It depends which pawn is it. If your opponent has A, C, F or H pawns, in these cases, you probably cannot win the game if your king is standing very far away from it, because it will lead to some stalemate ideas and the extra queen cannot win. So, but as we can see here in B, D, E and G files, it will be easily winning. All you have to do is to bring the queen closer to E3 and D3 squares, force your enemy's king to stand in front of the pawn, and meanwhile try to bring the king as soon as possible. So here white starts with queen E7, attacks the pawn, king D2, slowly but steadily we just want to get the queen as soon as possible closer. There's not a single thing black can do about it. And now we go with queen d3. So now black has to choose between king e1 and c1. If king c1, white wins the game, just takes the pawn. And after king gets in front of the pawn, which black is forced to, there is not a single thing they can do. Now it's time to bring the king closer. Whenever the king gets there, it's easy win for white. So after king g7, king f1 will be a mistake because pawn is pinned to the king. As long as your opponent doesn't threaten to promote the pawn, you are free to go for king f6 and get it closer. In case of king f2, you have to do the same technique. you can use queen f5 check, force your enemy's king to go here, queen e4 check, again, and whenever you get to e3 square, force the king to get here, now you bring the king here. So you actually try to use exactly the same kind of technique, and whenever you get to the final position, I'll just show you, demonstrate it really quickly. You can even go with queen d2 possible to pin the pawn, king f1, queen f4, and whenever you reach to this position and your king is really too close, after that you can even go for this check, and after king e1 just go with king f3, the pawn will be easily captured and you will win with an extra queen. Let's have a look at in which cases it will be a draw. For instance, f-pawn. The same applies with the c and a pawn, so please pay attention to that. In this case, white cannot win the game because this king is very far away, and unlike in the previous example, when black had e-pawn, it's impossible to win. But the reason is that if you use the same technique right now, for instance, trying to get closer as soon as possible, as we did in the previous example, here, yes, you force black to go on f1, but after you try to activate the king and black goes king g2, we discussed that there is this check, you want to get closer and again control f3, g3 and e3 squares. But the biggest problem is that whenever you go queen g3, black is not forced to play king f1, where you can bring the king closer. Black easily sidesteps with the king and you can't take the pawn because of stalemate idea. Because of that, you have to consistently guard the f1, black goes king g1, and there's not a single thing you can do about it, and this position will be a draw. The reason is that you can't bring the king closer to the pawn anytime soon. If these positions were more or less tougher for you, there is a video which I already have it on my channel about king and pawn endgames, but a little bit easier version. So feel free to browse around.